Professor Lefkowitz asking a question of Professor Bernal.
I'd like to ask Professor Bernal if he could point to some specific instances which he could cite where Egyptian thought influenced Greek philosophy directly, and if he could discuss some of those for us.
Well, the Greek philosophers were extremely respectful towards Egyptian philosophy, and particularly Plato in his later dialogues. The emphasis on geometry, which was the great strength of Egyptian mathematics and was the center of the Platonic educational system, I think is one example. I would also think that the system of ideas or forms which Parmenides and Plato pushed looks extremely Egyptian to me, but I can't prove it. I also think that the distinction between worlds of being and worlds of becoming, which fits Egyptian grammar extremely well and Egyptian cosmological notions extremely well, look very influential. I think that the Greek tradition, which was that Pythagoras and Plato had drawn from Egypt, seems altogether plausible. But what I insist, and here's our major methodological difference, is that I don't believe one can establish proof in these distant areas of history. One has to work on a system of probability, or what I call competitive plausibility. What is less unlikely than the other? Given the closeness of the two countries geographically, the contact that we know was taking place in the 6th and 5th century, when Greek philosophy began to be formed, the likelihood of contact is extremely high, and I think if anyone should have to prove anything, it should be those who would deny that there were significant Egyptian influences on Greek philosophy at this time, as the Greeks themselves associated the word philosophy with Egypt in their earliest references to it. It seems very strange that the people who maintain the Greeks' own tradition on this subject should be asked to prove their case rather than those who challenge it.
Well, I think those are some interesting ideas, and I would like to think very hard about them, but I think we must also think about the things that are very different and very, very confusing in the tradition, such as some of the things that are said about that Pythagoras learned in Egypt. He couldn't have learned there because they aren't Egyptian, particularly. There are some mistakes that are made in the Greek understanding of Egypt. And one problem is, in thinking about this contiguity, very few Greeks could get to Egypt over a long period of time, say from the 10th century to the 7th century. Then there was a window of opportunity, but then again the Persians moved in, kept the Greeks from getting there in any great number, and really until the conquest of Egypt by Alexander.
I hate to interrupt you, Professor Lefkowitz, but the idea here is to not just explain the question that you yourself have asked, but to follow through based on the response you got.
Well, I thought that's what I was doing, but...
All right, well then, actually we differ there. Professor Lefkowitz, would you like to ask a question? Professor Bernal, would you like to ask a question of Professor Lefkowitz?
Yes, as she and the predominant view of classicists at the moment concede that Egyptian art and architecture, and she's just written an article in the New Yorker showing a particular medical view was taken by the Greeks from Egypt, why is it so implausible to suppose that the Greeks took other aspects of their culture, particularly in this period, I believe also much earlier as well? What is the reason for denying the possibility, which was brought up by the Greeks themselves, of transmission of mathematical and philosophical ideas at the same time?
there's no reason to deny it. It's just simply to try and find what these ideas were. Now, in the case of the medical thing that you mentioned, it happens to be a particularly wrong idea, and of course, wrong ideas can be transmitted as well as right ideas. And this is one thing that in tracing the history of the world, we tend to concentrate so much on the glorious achievements and the glories of Greece, or the glories of Egypt. There are also some non-glories, and some of the medical ideas were one of them. I think we're all very lucky not to have been living at that time. But I would say there's nothing implausible about it at all. And there is a great Greek interest in Egypt, as you say, and that surfaces very clearly in the later dialogues of Plato. But I think that if you're going to talk about stealing ideas from Egypt, which I know you are not, but others have, then you really have to show some parallel text and show what is done. I think the idea of some influence is something that could fruitfully be discussed and pursued, and I would like to continue to do that and to continue to encourage others to work on that.
You want to follow up on your question? You get to ask Professor Clark a question.